Right now, more than 20 American warships are sitting in and around the Strait of Hormuz, forming what President Trump himself has called a steel wall. Not a metaphor, an actual operational blockade, currently holding 18 Iranian-linked vessels from entering or exiting Iranian ports, boarding 2 of them outright, disabling 2 more. And it exists for one reason, because Iran declared through its own military spokesperson, in its own words, that the Strait of Hormuz is Iran's invincible red line, a choke point it intends to keep closed under its own control no matter what Washington does in response. That single phrase, invincible red line, is the entire war compressed into 3 words. Before this conflict, roughly 1/5 of the entire world's traded oil and gas moved through that strait every single day, somewhere around 100 vessels crossing on a normal day. In the most recent 3-day stretch tracked by shipping data analysts, only 29 verified crossings happened in total, not per day, in 3 days combined. Iran didn't just threaten to close the world's most important shipping lane. It has, in practical terms, already done it, and the United States has spent the past several weeks building an entire military response specifically designed around forcing it back open. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how Iran's threat escalated from rhetoric into an actual blockade, what the United States did in direct response, why Trump's warning about power plants and bridges represents a completely different kind of escalation than anything earlier in this war, and why, even with strikes currently paused for diplomacy, this standoff is nowhere close to resolved. Stay with me for the full breakdown, because there's a lot more happening beneath the surface of this than the headlines are capturing. Quick note on sourcing before we start. Everything in this video comes from CENTCOM's own confirmed statements, cross-referenced reporting from CBS News, NBC News, Fox News, and Reuters, along with independent shipping data analysis from KPLR, tracking actual vessel movements through the strait in real time. I'll tell you plainly what's confirmed through official channels, what remains an Iranian claim without independent verification, and where the picture is still developing. Let's build this from the beginning. To understand how we got to an actual American naval blockade sitting in the Strait of Hormuz right now, you need the sequence of exactly how Iran's threat evolved, because this did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It built in stages, each one escalating past the last. Iran's threats to close the strait are not new to this specific war. In fact, versions of this same threat go back over a decade, tied to sanctions disputes and naval standoffs that never actually resulted in a real closure. For years, the conventional wisdom among analysts covering Iran was that these threats were mostly rhetorical, a way for Tehran to project strength and independence without ever actually following through, because closing the strait would risk cutting off Iran's own oil exports at the same time it hurt everyone else, and would practically guarantee direct American military retaliation. Go back far enough, and you find almost the exact same warning being issued and walked back repeatedly. Back in 2012, U.S. officials reportedly sent a covert message to Iran's supreme leader directly, warning that closing the strait would provoke an American response, after Iran had floated the threat amid tensions over sanctions and the assassination of an Iranian nuclear scientist. A few years later, Iran's naval leadership again threatened closure specifically toward American and Allied vessels, prompting the U.S. Navy at the time to simply stop escorting commercial ships through the strait, rather than risk a direct confrontation. Even then, longtime Iran analysts described these threats as largely rhetorical exercises, pointing out that Iran's own navy realistically lacked the capability to fully block the strait against a determined American response, and that the entire posture was more about projecting independence and strength domestically than about a genuine intention to follow through. That pattern held for roughly a decade. Threat, brief tension, quiet de-escalation, no actual closure. It's exactly why so much coverage of this current standoff initially treated Iran's newest threats with the same skepticism, assuming Tehran was running the same rhetorical playbook it always had. That assumption turned out to be wrong this time, and understanding exactly why it turned out wrong is the key to understanding everything that's happened since. This time is different, and the difference matters enormously. Back in March, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a direct threat that the strait would be completely closed if the United States struck Iranian power plants, stating explicitly that the closure would remain in effect until any destroyed infrastructure was rebuilt. Iran's parliament speaker reinforced that warning, cautioning that if Tehran's infrastructure became a target, key regional facilities could be irreversibly destroyed in response, while Iranian military officials separately floated the idea of striking U.S.-linked energy, technology, and water infrastructure across the wider Gulf region. That's a notably different framing than the vague, generalized threats of previous years. This wasn't Iran saying it might close the strait as leverage in some abstract sense. It was Iran tying a specific, concrete trigger, an attack on its power plants, directly to a specific, concrete consequence, full closure until rebuilding was complete. And Trump's response to that specific threat set the tone for everything that's followed since. He didn't back away from the power plant option to avoid triggering Iran's stated red line. He leaned directly into it, warning Iran that if it didn't open the strait within 48 hours, the United States would strike and, in his words, obliterate Iranian power plants, starting with the largest one first. Think about what that exchange actually represents. Iran named its most sensitive infrastructure as an untouchable red line, specifically to deter an American strike. Trump responded by naming that exact same infrastructure as the first target if Iran didn't comply. Rather than avoiding Iran's stated red line, the American strategy from early in this war has been to treat Iran's red lines as target lists. That pattern set up everything that's happened since, and it's the single most important thing to understand about how this specific standoff over the strait has unfolded compared to every previous Hormuz threat in the last 15 years. Iran keeps naming things it says are off limits, and Washington keeps treating those exact things as priorities. I want to pause here for a second, because if this kind of detailed sequence-by-sequence breakdown, actually tracing how a threat escalates step by step instead of just reacting to whatever headline dropped today, is what you want from war coverage, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. I track every stage of this conflict with the same level of detail, and I'll keep building out exactly how each escalation connects to the last one. Let's keep going, because the next stage of this is where the actual blockade takes shape. By July, the situation had moved well past warnings and threats into direct, sustained enforcement on both sides. After the ceasefire established through the June Memorandum of Understanding collapsed, following Iranian attacks on commercial vessels that didn't follow routes Tehran had unilaterally declared, the United States reinstated a full naval blockade on Iranian ports. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or a diplomatic warning. CENTCOM's own confirmed numbers tell the actual scale of it. More than 20 U.S. warships actively enforcing the blockade, 18 vessels prevented from entering or exiting Iranian ports as of the most recent count, 2 ships physically boarded by American forces, and 2 more disabled outright. Trump described the blockade directly, calling it a steel wall, language that leaves very little ambiguity about the administration's intent. This isn't a temporary pressure tactic designed to force a quick negotiating session. It's an operational military posture designed to be sustained indefinitely, for as long as it takes to force a change in Iranian behavior. Think about the sheer logistical commitment that number represents. 20 warships is not a token show of force stationed near a chokepoint for a few days of political theater. Sustaining that kind of presence requires a continuous rotation of fuel, munitions, and crew, along with the surrounding logistical infrastructure of resupply vessels, air cover, and intelligence support needed to keep an operation like that running for weeks without gaps. Every day that blockade continues is a day the U.S. Navy is committing meaningful resources specifically to this single choke point, resources that aren't available for other potential contingencies elsewhere in the world while they're tied up enforcing this specific standoff. That's precisely the kind of commitment that signals Washington views reopening the strait on its own terms as a strategic priority worth sustained resource allocation, not just a talking point in a press briefing. Iran's response to that blockade was to double down on its own closure of the strait rather than back away from it. IRGC Navy Commander Ali Osmaei posted directly, in response to statements from Iran's own commander-in-chief, that Iran would maintain its strategy of keeping the Strait of Hormuz closed, while promising to, in his words, inflict the severest blows on what he called the aggressor enemy. A separate spokesperson for Iran's Khatam al-Anbiya central headquarters, the umbrella command structure coordinating Iran's broader military response in this war, went even further, warning that Tehran would launch widespread military attacks across the entire region if the United States expanded its strikes against Iran's core infrastructure. And a different Iranian military spokesperson, in comments carried by regional outlets, framed the strait explicitly as, in his own words, Iran's invincible red line, stating flatly that the U.S. would not be allowed to intervene there under any circumstances. Notice how many separate voices within Iran's own military and political structure were making essentially the same statement through slightly different channels within a short window. The naval commander, the Khatam al-Anbiya spokesperson, and a separate unnamed military spokesperson, all converging on nearly identical rhetoric about the strait being untouchable. That kind of coordinated messaging across multiple official channels doesn't happen by accident. It suggests Tehran made a deliberate decision at a fairly senior level to flood public and international messaging with the same core claim from as many angles as possible, likely calculating that repetition across multiple official voices would make the red line framing harder for Washington and for the broader international community watching this standoff to simply dismiss as posturing from a single hardline faction. That phrase, invincible red line, deserves real scrutiny, because it's the kind of language that sets up exactly the dynamic we just walked through with the power plants. Naming something as untouchable is, in this specific war, functionally an invitation for the United States to treat it as the priority target. And that's precisely what happened. Trump didn't soften his rhetoric around the strait after Iran called it invincible. He escalated it, warning Iran directly that it needed to return to the negotiating table or face strikes hitting it, in his words, very hard, and delivering one of the most direct, specific threats of the entire war in a Fox News interview, telling Trey Yingst plainly that the following week would get, quote, really bad for Iran, specifically naming power plants and bridges as the next targets. Let's sit with that specific statement for a moment, because it represents a genuinely different category of threat than almost anything else said publicly during this war. Power plants and bridges are not primarily military targets, in the traditional sense, the way missile sites or naval bases are. They are the literal physical infrastructure that keeps a country's civilian population functioning day to day, electricity generation, and the transportation networks that move people, food, and goods between cities. A direct public presidential threat to target that specific category of infrastructure, delivered on national television, is about as unambiguous a signal as this war has produced that the United States is willing to escalate well beyond purely military targets if Iran continues refusing to reopen the strait on Washington's terms. It's worth thinking through why bridges specifically would be named alongside power plants, because the two targets actually serve somewhat different strategic purposes if a campaign like that were ever carried out. Power plants are about capacity, permanently degrading a country's ability to generate the electricity that runs everything from hospitals to water treatment to industrial production. Bridges are about mobility, restricting how quickly people, equipment, and military assets can move between regions of the country. Naming both together suggests a threat aimed not just at punishing Iran economically the way striking oil infrastructure would, but at constraining Iran's basic capacity to function and respond as a coordinated state, degrading both its ability to produce what it needs internally and its ability to move what remains where it needs to go. That's a considerably broader category of pressure than anything discussed in earlier phases of this war, when strikes remained focused primarily on missile sites, radar networks, and naval assets tied directly to the fighting itself. And Iran did not sit passively through any of this. The IRGC claimed direct hits on storage warehouses at a U.S. base in Kuwait and on a control tower belonging to the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, part of a wave of retaliatory strikes that also produced explosions reported near a military base hosting American forces in northern Iraq. CENTCOM's own confirmed strikes during the same stretch targeted Iranian military command centers, drone storage facilities, communication networks, coastal surveillance sites, and maritime capabilities, all explicitly described in CENTCOM's language as intended to diminish the threat Iran poses to civilian mariners and commercial vessels attempting to transit the strait. Iranian state media reported casualties from these strikes in the area of Avaz, with 4 people killed and 5 injured according to IRNA's own reporting, a detail worth including precisely because it underscores that this exchange, however abstract the strategic maneuvering might sound described from the outside, has produced real confirmed civilian and military casualties on Iranian soil throughout this entire stretch of fighting. Now here's the part of this story that I think most casual coverage has actually gotten wrong, or at least badly underexplained, and it's the genuine turning point in how this specific standoff has played out compared to every previous escalation cycle in this war. After what CENTCOM and multiple outlets confirmed as 13 consecutive nights of American strikes, the United States suspended the bombing campaign entirely. Not because Iran had capitulated, not because the strait had reopened. U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Mike Waltz stated directly that the suspension was a deliberate attempt to give diplomacy room to actually produce an agreement to reopen the strait, rather than continuing to escalate militarily while negotiations were underway in parallel. Think carefully about what the pause actually represents strategically, because it's a meaningfully different move than anything Iran's own doctrine seems built to anticipate. After 13 straight nights of sustained strikes, hitting military command infrastructure, drone facilities, and maritime capability specifically tied to the strait blockade, the United States had clearly demonstrated both the willingness and the sustained capacity to keep escalating indefinitely. Choosing to pause at that specific moment, rather than either continuing the tempo or declaring victory and standing down entirely, signals something important. Washington believes it has already established enough military credibility and pressure that the pause itself won't be read as weakness or hesitation. It's negotiating from a position where the threat of resumed strikes remains fully credible, precisely because 13 consecutive nights already proved the campaign could be sustained at that intensity for an extended stretch without American forces backing off. There's a useful comparison here to a pattern that's run through this entire war. Every previous ultimatum, whether it was over Iran's nuclear program earlier in the conflict or the direct 48-hour Hormuz deadline back in April, followed the same shape. a fixed date, followed by escalation if Iran didn't comply in time. This pause breaks that shape in an interesting way. It isn't a deadline with a fixed date attached at all. It's an indefinite suspension explicitly tied to whether diplomacy produces results, which means Iran doesn't get a calendar date to plan, around the way it has with prior ultimatums in this conflict. The strikes could resume tomorrow if talks stall, or they could remain paused for weeks if Washington judges that real progress is being made. That kind of open-ended condition puts considerably more pressure on Iran to actually demonstrate good faith movement in the Oman talks, rather than simply running out a fixed clock the way it's approached previous deadlines throughout this war. And the diplomacy that pause was designed to enable has actually been moving, even if the outcome remains genuinely uncertain. Iran and Oman have been in direct negotiations over the future regime governing passage through the strait, with Iranian officials confirming to Russian state media that Tehran and Muscat will jointly determine future transit fees for ships crossing the waterway. That detail alone tells you something important about what Iran is actually trying to achieve through this entire standoff, something that goes well beyond simply reopening the strait to normal traffic. Iran wants a permanent structural change to how the strait operates, one where it, in coordination with Oman, has ongoing authority over fees and transit conditions, rather than simply returning to the pre-war arrangement where the strait functioned as an open international waterway with no toll attached at all. That ambition runs directly into the position the Trump administration has held consistently and explicitly since this entire dispute began. Vice President J.D. Vance, following negotiations held in Islamabad, made the American position unambiguous. If the world accepts that any country bordering an international waterway can start charging money simply because it happens to be near that country's territorial waters, that precedent would spread like what Vance described directly as a contagion, disrupting the basic principle of freedom of navigation everywhere else. Similar choke points exist around the globe. Oman's own foreign minister has publicly stated that any future arrangement concerning the strait would not involve imposing transit fees, a position that directly contradicts what Iran's own ambassador to Russia has separately claimed about ongoing fee negotiations between Tehran and Muscat. That contradiction between what Oman is saying publicly and what Iran claims is being negotiated privately is exactly the kind of gap that makes predicting how this specific standoff resolves genuinely difficult from the outside. I want to bring in one more thread here, because it directly connects to something that should reframe how you think about Iran's entire negotiating posture throughout this stretch. Iran rejected an actual proposal from Oman to bring in a separate country to help demine the strait, according to Iran's own Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi. Think about what that rejection actually implies. If the strait genuinely needed demining to reopen safely, and Iran turned down outside help to accomplish that specific task, one of two things is likely true. Either Iran doesn't actually want the strait fully reopened to normal international traffic on terms it doesn't control, or Iran is treating the mining and clearing process itself as additional leverage, something it alone controls the timeline for, rather than a purely technical problem it wants solved as quickly as possible by whoever is capable of doing it fastest. Let's talk about what this entire standoff is actually costing, in numbers, because the economic dimension here is genuinely staggering once you see the actual figures, rather than vague references to disruption. Before this war, roughly 100 vessels transited the Strait of Hormuz on a typical day. Shipping data company Kepler's tracking showed only 29 verified crossings across an entire 3-day stretch from July the 24th through the 26th, a collapse in traffic of well over 90% compared to normal pre-war volume. Every one of those missing crossings represents oil and gas that isn't reaching global refineries, tankers sitting idle absorbing daily costs, and insurance markets pricing risk into every voyage that does still attempt the crossing. Oil prices have moved directly in response to the on-again, off-again rhythm of this conflict, falling during the brief weekend pause in fighting between the US and Iran, a detail that itself tells you how tightly global energy markets are now tracking the day-to-day military status of this specific war, rather than treating it as background noise. It's worth putting that 90% collapse into a broader frame, because a fifth of the world's traded oil and gas is not a small, easily absorbed slice of global supply. Refineries across Asia, Europe, and beyond are built around specific crude grades and supply schedules that assume a reasonably predictable flow through this exact choke point. When that flow drops by more than 90%, even temporarily, the ripple effects don't stay contained to the Gulf. Refineries have to scramble for alternative crude sources, often at a premium. Shipping companies that do still attempt the crossing face insurance premiums that can run many times higher than normal war risk rates. And energy traders price all of that uncertainty directly into futures contracts that determine what people pay at the pump months down the line, regardless of whether they've ever heard of the Strait of Hormuz at all. This is the actual mechanism connecting a standoff between two governments to a stranger's grocery bill on the other side of the planet. And it's a mechanism that's been actively running in real time for months now, rather than a hypothetical worst-case scenario analysts warn about. And the economic damage isn't confined to global shipping and energy markets sitting outside Iran's own borders. Iran's own government spokesperson, Fatemeh Mohajerani, confirmed directly that the broader conflict with the United States and Israel has reduced the country's natural gas production capacity by roughly 230 million cubic meters, according to Reuters, reporting on her statement. She also confirmed that Bushehr Airport remains completely out of service following damage sustained during the conflict. These are not abstract wartime inconveniences. Natural gas production capacity feeds directly into domestic heating, electricity generation, and industrial output inside Iran itself, meaning ordinary Iranians are absorbing real, measurable economic damage from a standoff their own government has chosen to escalate rather than resolve through the kind of unconditional, straight reopening Washington has been demanding since the ceasefire first collapsed. There's also a darker domestic dimension to this stretch of the war that deserves mention, because it tells you something about the internal pressure Iran's government is managing alongside the external military and economic pressure. Iranian state media confirmed the execution of two men this week for their roles in nationwide protests that occurred back in January, part of what human rights groups tracking the situation describe as a broader pattern of death sentences, handed out since the war with the United States began. A government simultaneously fighting an external war, absorbing sustained economic damage from its own strait closure, and executing domestic protesters connected to unrest from earlier in the year is a government managing genuine multi-front pressure, not simply projecting strength from a position of comfortable stability, regardless of how confident its public statements about an invincible red line might sound. That combination, external military pressure paired with visible internal repression, is worth reading as a single connected picture, rather than two unrelated stories running in parallel. Governments generally escalate domestic crackdowns when they're worried about internal stability cracking under external strain, not when they feel secure. A wartime economy already absorbing reduced gas production, a non-functional major airport, and months of sustained strikes on military and infrastructure targets is exactly the kind of environment where public frustration tends to build, and executions tied to protest activity from months earlier suggest Iran's leadership is treating that internal pressure as a genuine threat worth responding to harshly. At the very same moment, its military spokespeople are publicly projecting total confidence about holding an invincible red line against the United States. Those two signals, external bravado and internal crackdown, point in very different directions about how secure Tehran's leadership actually feels behind closed doors. Now, let's connect this back to the diplomatic thread, because there's a genuinely important detail buried in recent reporting that clarifies exactly where Iran believes it currently stands relative to Washington. An Iranian official stated directly that it was the Americans who initially requested dialogue, adding that Washington had communicated through Oman that it would not carry out further military action against Iran while that dialogue continued. At the same time, that same official reiterated Iran's position that the Strait, in his words, will never return to its pre-war state, explicitly naming that as a persistent sticking point in any negotiation with the United States going forward. Notice the contradiction embedded in that single statement. Iran is simultaneously claiming the diplomatic upper hand, framing the U.S. as the party that requested talks and agreed to hold off on further strikes, while also refusing to budge on the single issue that actually matters most to Washington and to the global shipping industry watching the standoff from the outside. Whether the strait returns to functioning as a genuinely open international waterway or becomes something permanently altered by Iranian and Omani control over fees and transit conditions. This is precisely the pattern that should worry anyone hoping for a quick, clean resolution to this specific standoff. Iran appears to be treating the current pause in strikes as validation of its negotiating position rather than as a temporary window. Washington is offering specifically to see whether Tehran will make the concessions it's actually asking for. If Iran spends this pause consolidating its claim over straight transit fees through parallel negotiations with Oman, rather than moving toward the unconditional reopening the U.S. has demanded since the ceasefire first broke down, the strikes that paused after 13 consecutive nights have every reason to resume, and resume at a scale informed by everything Trump has already publicly threatened regarding power plants and bridges. Let's zoom out to what this standoff means for people who have absolutely nothing to do with the underlying dispute between Washington and Tehran, because that's ultimately the audience actually paying the price for however this resolves. Every tanker that doesn't cross the strait is fuel that doesn't reach a refinery somewhere else in the world, whether that's gasoline reaching a filling station, jet fuel reaching an airport, or natural gas reaching a power plant that keeps electricity flowing to homes with no connection whatsoever to this conflict. Insurance underwriters, pricing the risk of transiting a strait with an active naval blockade, disabled vessels, and ongoing military strikes on both sides, are going to price that risk into every single voyage that does still attempt the crossing. And those costs move downstream through global shipping rates, until they eventually show up as a few extra cents on a gallon of gas or a few extra dollars on a shipped product in countries with zero direct stake in whether Iran or the United States wins this specific standoff. And there's a human cost here that goes beyond economics entirely. Crews on commercial vessels, the overwhelming majority of whom have no political stake in this dispute, are the ones physically navigating a waterway currently patrolled by more than 20 American warships on one side and Iranian naval forces enforcing closure on the other, with active mines still reportedly present, given Iran's own rejection of outside demining assistance. Every one of those 29 crossings recorded over that recent 3-day stretch represented a real ship with a real crew choosing to attempt a transit that, under normal circumstances before this war, would have been entirely routine and completely unremarkable. So where does this actually leave us right now, and what should you genuinely be watching for in the days ahead? The honest, unhyped assessment is this: the pause in American strikes is a deliberate, calculated window, not a sign that Washington has softened its underlying demands. CENTCOM's blockade remains fully in place, more than 20 warships continuing to enforce it, 18 vessels still being prevented from moving in or out of Iranian ports. Trump's specific threat regarding power plants and bridges hasn't been withdrawn, only paused alongside the broader strike campaign to give the current round of Oman-mediated diplomacy a genuine chance to produce results. If those negotiations produce what Iran appears to actually want, a permanent transit fee arrangement with Oman that Iran effectively controls, rather than the unconditional reopening the U.S. has demanded, expect this pause to end, and expect the strikes that resume to escalate directly toward the infrastructure targets Trump has already named publicly. If, instead, genuine movement toward an unconditional reopening emerges from the Oman Channel, this could be the first real off-ramp this specific phase of the war has produced. Based on everything walked through in this video, the pattern across this entire conflict, Iran naming red lines that Washington then treats as priority targets, suggests the first outcome remains considerably more likely than the second. Before you go, 2 things I genuinely appreciate. First, if walking through the full sequence here, how a years-old rhetorical threat about closing the strait became an actual functioning blockade, with real ships, real casualties, and real economic damage on both sides, gave you a clearer picture than any single headline could. Share this with someone who's been trying to follow this standoff without a full timeline to make sense of it. That's the only way analysis like this reaches the people who actually want it, instead of getting buried under shorter, louder clips, repeating the same 3 lines about oil prices. Second, I want your read in the comments. Do you think the Oman-mediated talks actually produce a genuine reopening of the strait? Or does Iran keep negotiating a version of control over transit fees that Washington has already said, through Vice President Vance directly, it will never accept? Drop your take below. I read every one of them, and if this breakdown delivered real value, hit like so more people trying to understand what's actually happening in this standoff get the chance to see it. Let's close with the full picture of where this stands. Iran's threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, once treated by analysts as mostly rhetorical based on more than a decade of similar warnings that never resulted in an actual closure, became real this year, first through a specific threat tied to any American strike on Iranian power plants, then through an actual reduction in strait traffic of more than 90% compared to pre-war volume, and finally, through Iran's own military spokesperson declaring the strait an invincible red line, it would not allow the U.S. to intervene in under any circumstances. The United States responded by reinstating a full naval blockade, more than 20 warships strong, disabling and boarding Iranian-linked vessels, while Trump escalated his own rhetoric directly, naming power plants and bridges as the next targets if Iran didn't return to negotiations. 13 consecutive nights of American strikes followed before the campaign paused specifically to give Oman-mediated diplomacy room to produce results. Diplomacy that remains genuinely unresolved, with Iran insisting the strait will never return to its pre-war state and pursuing a transit fee arrangement with Oman that directly contradicts the American and Omani public position against imposing any fees at all. Iran's own economy has absorbed real damage throughout this standoff. Natural gas production capacity down significantly, a major airport still out of service, alongside a domestic crackdown that has included executions tied to protests earlier in the year. And the entire global shipping industry, along with everyone who buys fuel or ships goods anywhere in the world, is currently absorbing the downstream cost of a choke point carrying 1/5 of the planet's traded oil and gas, sitting reduced to a fraction of its normal traffic. Whether the current pause becomes the moment this standoff genuinely resolves, or simply the calm before strikes resume at the scale Trump has already threatened, is the single question that will define what happens next. Stay locked in, because the moment this pause breaks one way or the other, I'll be covering exactly what it means with the same level of depth.